Yeah, hello. Welcome to session 7 that deals with the works of Karl Marx. Now, session 7, 8, and 9 are actually about Marx alone. And within sociology, Marx and Emil Durkheim that we discussed in the last 3 sessions, and Max Weber that we're going to discuss after Karl Marx. These 3 are considered the most important of the founding fathers to the discipline of sociology because most of the ideas they developed continue to fertilize sociological thinking up till today. Now, Marx was born in 1818 and died in 1883. He was born in a small town in Germany called Trier, and I trust you look at his biography and then fill in the gap because that much we cannot go in much detail now. But let me say for the sake of simplicity that Marx was a radical scholar. And so Marx was never liked by the political establishment in Germany because he often critiqued the society. So Marx was forced to leave Germany. He stayed in France, where he thought there were radical scholars that he could join, or radical scholars that we call socialists. And then he didn't also stay in France for too long. He moved on to England, finally. And Marx, that is where he wrote in the later part of his life, that's why he wrote many of his books. Now, Marx lived a very simple life. He was a poor intellectual because he never held any academic position. And so poverty actually afflicted him. And some of his children died because of poverty. But along the way, he met a fine gentleman called Friedrich Engels, whose father owned a number of factories in Germany and in Britain. So Friedrich Engels was a rich man's son. So he bailed out Marx along the way. So they became good friends, lifelong friends, and they often collaborated and wrote a number of books. So even though we say Marx wrote this book and that, Friedrich Engels also partnered with him. So sometimes we want to understand Marx's ideas as not only Marx, but the work also of Friedrich Engels. Now, Marx and Engels wrote a number of books. I think in the slides you see that there are about 12. The Holy Family, he wrote it with Engels. The Poverty of Philosophy, the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, the German Ideology, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Class Struggle in France, the 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, the Grundrisse, the Critique of Political Economy, and even 3 volumes of Capital that some have published after his death, the Civil War in France, and the Critique of the Gotha Program. So Marx was highly academic, and he devoted so much of his life to writing. So you can see why somebody who is so involved in write academic books will be living a poor life and all that. But Marx's ideas have been so influential. Marx never considered himself a sociologist. He considered himself as a political activist. But so much sociology is found in his work that sociologists have appropriated his ideas as constituting some of the founding ideas of sociology. Marx is also interested in politics, he discussed political ideas, and so political science have also drawn on Marxist ideas in their discipline. Now, we will be concerned with Marx's first ideas. How did they develop? And here, I want to say that Marx developed his ideas based on the philosophical understanding of the world that was furnished by George Hegel. Now, George Hegel was a philosopher who lived long before Marx entered the University of Jena. Now, but George Hegel's ideas were so fashionable at the time. Marx converted to some of his ideas and rejected some. And on this note, Hegel developed what we call dialectical thinking. Now, dialectical thinking involves three interrelated processes, which are thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Now, George Hegel is thought to be an idealist philosopher. Idealist philosopher in the sense that he lays emphasis on ideas, the power of ideas. So, idealist philosopher. And Hegel's thinking is that the human mind operates in such a way that dialectics generate thesis and later generate antithesis and synthesis. Now, let me break it down for you. Thesis, the idea is that the mind has a way of thinking. So an idea will occur to the mind, but sooner or later, an opposing idea also occurs. So there's contradiction in these two thinkings, the thesis and antithesis. So thesis and antithesis, these are positional ideas. Now, the mind will not settle down for the contradiction. So the mind generates a new an idea which we call the synthesis. So dialectical thinking is that the mind generates an idea first, which Hegel calls thesis, and then an opposing idea comes, which he calls antithesis. But the two contradictions cannot exist, or the two ideas rather cannot exist. So we have to generate a synthesis. So we have to come out with a new idea. Now, this process, according to Hegel, continues, is not ending. It continues and goes on and goes on. Now, what Hegel wants us to understand is that whatever society we create, whatever civilization we create, is the work of ideas. That ideas have powerful influence on what we do as human beings. So throughout history, this mind working in dialectical fashion generate ideas. The ideas develop in opposition, the synthesis. So we use this way of generating ideas to construct societies and improve upon existing societies and conditions. Now, Marx believed that yes, there is dialectics, but for him, the dialectics was not working in the human mind. It wasn't working in the human mind, but it is working in the material world. Now, because Marx thought this way, people said Marx has turned Hegel over his head, or it's like opposing Hegel in a way. So here, Marx accepted the dialectics, but for him, the dialectics are not working in the minds of human beings, but it's working in the material conditions within which they find themselves. So in a way, we're talking about ideas and matter. Ideas are things that exist in our minds, but matter is something that exists outside the mind. So in the material world, or where he says human beings enter into production, this is where the dialectics work. And material production is about what? It's about producing material things for our existence. Now, material production is about the economic sphere, where we enter into relationship in agricultural sector, industrial sector, and all that, when we produce things to satisfy our food needs and all that. Because Marx believed that we have to eat first before we think. So the first task of human living is material production. Imagine if I move all of you as a class and I deposit you, let's say, in a forest region in Ghana, and I say, well, that is your world today. The first task that you engage in is material production, how to produce material things to survive as a group over there. So Marx thinking is that we have to eat first before we can engage in discussing ideas and all that. Now this is very important because the whole ideas that Marx generated is about material production, and this is where he thinks that we generate conflict in society, we generate contradictions, and as we try to resolve those contradictions, we generate new society as well. Just like Hegel was saying, if we have an idea, there's a contradictory idea, we come out with synthesis. Marx's argument is that when we engage in material production, we create contradictions. And when we want to resolve those contradictions materially, we create a new society. So the same idea is running through, but one is saying that it's in the mind, one is saying it happens in the material world. Now, which means that Marx asserted dialectical thinking, but he rejects the idea that it was happening in the mind. Because he appropriated dialectical thinking, or the dialectics rather, and he's putting it into the material world, he created what we call dialectical materialism. So Hegel created dialectical thinking, Marx created dialectical materialism. And he goes on to discuss how the dialectical materialism unfolded throughout the ages, particularly in the case of Europe, which was his social laboratory, or where the context within which he was writing. So what we'll do in the later slides is to look at how historical materialism unfolded and all that. So Marx agreed with Hegel's dialectics, but he says that the dialectics is not in the mind, but in the material, the real world in which humans live, especially the economic institution where we enter into relations with each other to produce for our material existence. So you shouldn't be surprised when Marx's analysis of society focuses so much on the economic sphere. So I would like to end here, and then we move on to the next slide.